Hey everybody, Mr. Dustin here, and welcome again to Bible class. Now, I hope you are still reading your Bibles, and I hope that you are still working on your memory verses. Now, if you remember on Sunday, we were talking about Hebrews chapter 11, and I want to know, can you still quote Hebrews 11 verse 1? That's one of our memory verses, right? Now, faith is being sure, right? Quote it for me. Certain of what we do not see, right? So, I hope that you're still working on that, Hebrews 11:1. And I hope that you remember, on Sunday, we were talking about people who did things by faith, right? There were a few in particular. We talked about Enoch, the man who was 365 years old early on in Genesis, walked with God and was no more. Then we talked about Noah. What did Noah do, right? He built the ark to save him and his family and all of these animals. What about Abraham? We talked about Abraham as well. Do you remember him? When his wife was 90 and he was 100, they had the son of promise, Isaac. All of these things happened by faith. Well, today we're going to talk about a man and really an entire nation that walked by faith. Still in Hebrews 11. We're going to talk about how they did things that seemed impossible and probably challenged them very much, but they trusted that God would provide. So grab your Bible, turn over to Hebrews chapter 11, and we're going to read a few verses here. We're going to start in verse 23. So Hebrews 11:23, we're going to read through verse 29. Here it is. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child. I lost my spot. There we are. He was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover in the application of blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land. But when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. So let me ask you, who got mentioned first in the story of Moses? We just read it. Moses' parents, right, by faith. Why do you think that is? Why would it be his parents? Do you remember what was going on at the time when Moses was born? I hope that you do. And then, what was Pharaoh doing to the Israelite or Hebrew baby boys at that time? And I want to ask you to take a minute. You're going to pause and discuss. Do you remember what he was doing to the baby boys? And why was it that he was doing that? Press pause and we'll talk about that. Pharaoh was afraid. Really, that's the issue. He was afraid that the Israelites were getting too strong for the Egyptians, and he had to keep them under control as slaves. So he decided, we need to start killing some of these baby boys that are being born because there's too many of them. So that was what was going on when Moses was born. He thought that would keep them on track for his ability to control the Israelite population. But it didn't work. Now, knowing that Pharaoh was trying to kill those Israelite baby boys, what do you think about the fact that Moses' parents kept him alive? Was it brave, or did it take faith? Maybe it was some of both. Why don't you take a second and talk about that with your family? Was it bravery? Was it faith? Or maybe it was both. Pause and talk about that, and we'll talk soon. If you ask me, I think it was both. sometimes it takes bravery to do what our faith tells us we need to do. One thing that I came across is that being brave does not mean you're not scared, but it means when you are scared, you do what's right anyway. There's a cowboy actor that's called John Wayne. You may or may not have seen any of his movies, but I bet your parents have. The quote from him says, "Being brave is being scared to death and saddling up anyway." So in a sense, Moses' parents were probably scared because they knew we could get in trouble for this. But they hid Moses for 3 months. Then someone else raised him. Who was that? It was Pharaoh's daughter, right? Do you remember who got to nurse and to take care of Moses? It was his own mother. When Moses was grown up, what did he do? Do you remember that? Did he stay in Pharaoh's house? No, he didn't. He chose to leave. When he was almost 40 years old, he left. Why do you think that Moses left? Do you think life would have been easier for him if he stayed in Pharaoh's house? I think it would have been a lot easier for him if he stayed in Pharaoh's house, because in Pharaoh's house, they weren't making him a slave. So the question is, why did he leave Pharaoh's house? I think that's a good opportunity for you to pause and discuss with your family. Why did Moses leave Pharaoh's house? It would have been easier to stay. Talk about that and we'll come back. Chapter 11, 26. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt. Why? Because he was looking ahead to his reward. I think that is why Moses left. We, as people, we cannot always do what is easiest. Many times, the easiest thing to do is not the right thing to do. And many times, the hardest thing to do is the right thing to do. And in many regards, that's what Moses chose. This was a hard thing, to go from being in the king's palace to where did he go? If you remember what happened next, Moses was about 40. He went out and saw the affliction of his people, and he actually ended up killing an Egyptian. And then his own people knew, are you going to kill us too? You're going to be judged? And so he ran away, and he went and he was a shepherd in the wilderness for 40 more years. That's a long time. Then one day, look, a burning bush, and it's not burning up, it's just on fire. So he went to go check it out. What happened at that burning bush? Do you remember? Do you remember what he heard from God? What was the instruction? What was he asked to do? He was asked to go confront Pharaoh. Let my people go, says the God of the Hebrews. Did he want to go? Was he real excited about that? Do you remember? There were several excuses that he made. He's like, I don't know about this. I don't talk too good, right? He says, I can't speak well. So they said, well, I'm going to send your brother Aaron with you. He'll speak for you. And he kept making excuses. And he goes, just send somebody else. Then God got angry and he said, no, you're going. And he did. He went. Finally, when he agreed to go, with Aaron's help, and of course, God's help. What was going to happen if Pharaoh did not let the people go? Do you remember there were 10 things that happened? We often call them plagues. And those were really to encourage, if you will, Pharaoh to let the people go. But they weren't just plagues on the people. They were judgments on the gods of Egypt. In a sense, well, not in a sense, in truth, those are no gods at all. They're drawings and idols and things. and they could not stand against the living God of the Hebrews. Now, what was the last plague? Do you remember the last one? It was the death of the firstborn in Egypt, right? So the Israelites also developed, because of God's commands, a feast that went along with that. It involved a lamb and some other things. Do you remember that feast? What was it called? It was the Passover, right? Because the destroyer passed over the Israelites. So what did the Israelites have to do in order to escape the destroyer? I hope you remember they had to paint blood over their doors, right? From the lamb, year-old without blemish. Now let me ask you this question. Did that make logical sense? Like if I had just come up with an idea, how could I be safe from a destroyer? Would I say, I know, I'm going to choose a lamb that's a year old, doesn't have any blemish, I'm going to take its blood and paint it over my door, then I'll be safe. Would you just come to that from a logical train of thought? I don't know. But how would blood keep this destroyer out of your house? Does it just make sense? I want you to take a minute. Talk with your family about that. Does it make logical sense that you would just paint blood and then you would be safe? Or is there something more to it? And we'll talk some more. Again, if you ask me, the logic doesn't work very well because blood, it just doesn't make sense that I would paint this on my door and then I would be safe. But it did make sense because God said, this is what it's going to take. And I think that's what makes it special, because it doesn't make sense in our brains, and that proves that God said this is the truth and that's how it works. So he said the destroyer will pass over your houses and you'll be unharmed if you do this. And that's the way it worked. So by faith, they did it. They painted their doors and they survived. They lived because they obeyed God's command. Then what happened? Now the Israelites all left Egypt. They were driven out. And after they'd gone just a short distance into the wilderness, they came to a big body of water that we know is called the Red Sea. Was Pharaoh really glad that the people were gone? Or did he change his mind about letting them go? Well, if we all remember right, he did change his mind. And when Pharaoh changed his mind, what did he do? He sent his army with their chariots and their horses chasing after the Israelites. And they pursued them, and they got to where they were standing at the edge of a Red Sea. And it says they were hemmed in by the wilderness. And the army of Egypt came up behind the Israelites. They had nowhere to run. So what did they do? They cried out to God, the living God that just delivered them out, and they cried out to Moses. And what happened? Moses, he held his hand out that the staff of God was in. Over the sea, and God parted the sea in front of them. And what does it say that the water did? And if you read the account from Exodus, it says that the water stood up in a wall on the right, and it stood up in the wall on the left. Is water supposed to do that? Have you ever seen water do that? I haven't seen water do that. Would you have been nervous to walk in between two giant walls of water doing what it's not supposed to do? I think I would have been nervous. It would have been intimidating to look on either side and to know I'm standing between walls of water. What if they fall? It would have taken faith, and it would have taken bravery to do what my faith told me was right. Just like Moses' parents had. They were brave and they followed their faith. It took that to walk in between the walls of water. Because again, this is not what water is supposed to do. And so by faith, the people crossed the Red Sea on dry ground. Now, each of these people we've discussed, they all did things by faith that impress us, whether it was Noah building a giant boat, Abraham, and Moses, right? Each of these people by faith. So I want to ask you, take a minute here, and I want you to press pause and discuss this. What is it about these people's faith that makes it ordinary under extraordinary circumstances? Think about that for just a minute, and we'll come back and talk some more. Pause and discuss. When I think about this, what makes Moses' parents do something ordinary under extraordinary circumstances? It's ordinary that people take care of their children when they're born. That's not weird. The extraordinary part is they were commanded by the king of the land. He says, you must kill this child, and they didn't do it. They disobeyed. They hid their child knowing the penalty. That's under extraordinary circumstances. They did the right thing. Moses, go talk to this guy. Tell people, hey, let my people go. That's not that weird of a thing to do. But he's the king of the land, and he's got all these slaves. Just get rid of all your slaves. That's extraordinary circumstances. Abraham, he believed that he would have a son. That's not an odd thing for a young man to believe. People have children. But they don't have children when they're 100 years old and his wife is 90 years old, and it says that childbearing age had passed. Those are extraordinary circumstances. So they had ordinary things that they believed would happen under extraordinary circumstances. And I think that's why we call them heroes of the faith. So I want to look at the passage that leads up to Hebrews chapter 11. This is in chapter 10, starting in verse 32. And it really tells of a people that suffered and they remained faithful. So starting in chapter 10, verse 32 through 35. Remember those earlier days after you had received the light, when you endured in a great conflict full of suffering. Sometimes you were publicly exposed to insult and persecution. At other times you stood side by side with those who were so treated. You suffered along with those in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property. Confiscation means just taking it. People just took it, almost like stealing. Because you knew that you yourselves had better and lasting possessions. So do not throw away your confidence. It will be richly rewarded. These people suffered tremendous persecution, and they remained faithful to God. Now, remaining faithful to God throughout your life is not all that unusual. Instead, it's maintaining your faith when things are so difficult that people are making fun of you and insulting you and taking your property. That is when it's difficult. That's extraordinary circumstances. And knowing that they have remained faithful without seeing the promise of God fully completed in Jesus, the Hebrew writer says this, starting in verse 36, you need to persevere so that when you have done the will of God, you will receive what is promised. For in just a little while, he who is coming will come and will not delay. But my righteous one will live by faith. And I take no pleasure in the one who shrinks back. I think this might be one of my favorite verses in all of Scripture. But we do not belong to those who shrink back and are destroyed, but to those who have faith and are saved. We are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed and lose their faith. In other words, when things get difficult, we don't shrink back. We keep our faith. And that is what the people in Hebrews 11 have done. Especially those we don't really have names for at the close of the chapter. And I want to read just a little bit more from Hebrews chapter 11. We're going to start in verse 32. What more shall I say? I don't have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who, through faith, conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Do you remember some of those things? Think about Daniel, closed the mouths of the lions. Think about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They quenched the fury of the flames. Their weakness was turned to strength because of God. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. Even though they had such great faith that they endured all these things, they still didn't have what we have today. Salvation, which was promised to these people, but they did not receive it during their life. It has been given to us today through Jesus Christ, and we can read of it in His Word. And as a result of this, I always like to say, be strong and courageous, Hebrews 12. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before Him, He endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider Him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Keep your faith. Keep your eyes on Jesus. Run the race set before you. Do not grow weary and do not lose heart. That's the ordinary thing to do under extraordinary circumstances. You can do that. So can I. We can be heroes of the faith. So we have a script that you can do. I think it's neat. It can involve your whole family. You get to be Enoch, Noah, Abraham, and Moses, and of course, there's a narrator. Go through this script and read of the stories of each of those people. And I think the best part is, my favorite part, is there's the recurring chant, if you will, that everybody says together. We do not belong to those who shrink back and are destroyed, but to those who have faith and are saved. And that describes you and me. We do not lose our faith. We preserve it and are saved. And I hope that you will enjoy today's Bible lesson and be challenged by it, and that you will be strong and courageous. And I'll see you again on Sunday.